we want to actually make recording. All right. We actually want to make a contribution here. We want to do meaningful work that contributes to our community and is actually implemented. So in trying to figure out what that niche is, we got really positive feedback about this hyperlocal gap analysis. So not so much a focus necessarily even on doing a climate action plan that's a finished document, but really identifying the conversations that we need to be having, but are not currently having. And then doing some background research on that, and then bringing that back to the Joint Policy Board so that conversation can happen at the commission levels. So really trying to serve as that group that is keeping an eye on the big picture and say, hey, we're really not looking at this issue over here, and we really need to be. This has kind of slipped off the radar, and we need to put it back on. Or maybe it was never there anyway. So I thought that was really excellent feedback, something specific that we can work on. It is a direction that we've already been heading towards, especially with this survey for city, county, and GRU, and then with this sort of worksheet that we have given ourselves to look at, again, hyper-local impacts of, in this case, immediate shocks to the system. And then those long-term stressors are still on the radar as something that we need to talk about, and something that is certainly within our purview, but again, with a specific focus on gap analysis and local, hyper-local impacts of climate change that need to be part of the conversation. So you guys have any questions or thoughts on that before we move on? Yeah, Jennison.
Yeah, I was wondering if I may have missed some of this information since I was absent in the last meeting, but I wondered if, in addition to the scope that Jones Edmonds is doing and the online survey that they're doing, if there's been serious discussion of more like focus groups or in-depth interviews or town halls, or something that goes deeper than that online survey, because we know we're going to miss people through just that.
Yeah, we're gonna miss us.
I know they'll do a great job with it, but yeah.
I guess that Heather or Steve, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely in the plans for this process. One of the thoughts was to get the greenhouse gas inventory data back, so that there's something to speak around. We don't have to wait for that to come back. It's really up to you guys how you want to see this unfold. We did put in for a grant with DEP for community engagement in order to do a large outreach and education campaign. We thought we would have heard back from now. We haven't heard back yet. With or without the grant, we do have some money set aside for community engagement that could be used towards that. So really we can work with you all to determine what makes the most sense and the best timing. I think the thing about hosting a town hall or going out and doing focus groups is we really have to have set questions that we want answered. We really need to think strategically about what we're trying to get from folks. Deidre Houchin, our equity and outreach manager, has said that she's available to help with wording for questions once we start working on something like that. So we do have her as a resource. But yeah, it's really up to you guys to think about what makes the most sense. My only caution is we just want to be very strategic, because we're going to ask for people's time and energy and figure out, I think that's for the community engagement conversation today, is to talk about that and, what does make the most sense.
No, that's a great segue. Unless anybody else had comments on what I had just mentioned about, focusing on this gap analysis. If there are no more comments on that, we can certainly move on to this broader discussion of community engagement.
I think that the gap analysis is a great platform from which to work. But we got to make sure, and this is something that we kind of worked on as a committee, to make sure that the questions and the directions that we were headed aligned themselves a lot with what the county actually wanted. So we want to make sure that we're working in conjunction with, so that the direction that they need and the information they need, we're heading in that direction, and everything can kind of fit together. I think that once we kind of understand that, that will give us more focus when we go into the community to ask the right questions and to know which direction we're kind of, rather than just grabbing information, we can grab information with the focus to it. And I think that over our period of working as a group here, that's one thing that kind of come out, that we want something from the county to tell us, and the city to tell us where we're headed. Are we headed in the right direction? Are we headed in the direction that they want us to add information to? And I think as we get these surveys back, we can kind of start focusing our questions and our direction to the community in a manner that that they can understand what we want to make sure that the community understands what we're doing. And before we can get them to understand, we have to understand. And because as was mentioned, we want to make sure that we take good use of people's time.
Agreed. So I think that, so the December 13th, so this Monday, there's a joint water and climate policy board meeting, and I'm going to be giving updates from CCAC to that group. And one of those updates is going to be basically seeking confirmation of this idea of pursuing a focus on gap analyses, to get confirmation from them about, like, is this the direction that you really want us to go, right? So Commissioner Ward sounded very enthusiastic about that. He's only one member of the board, and so I want to bring it before the entire body and be able to say, and we've gotten the feedback that we've gotten in the past makes me think that that is a direction that they want us to go, right? They wanted us to focus on things that are actionable for them. So that I will, at our January meeting, I'll report back about how that December 13th meeting went. You're also all welcome to, like, listen in if you want. And that's agenda item number 7. I'll actually share with you the slides that I was going to share with them to get your feedback. So the slides already had to be submitted. They have to go in a week early to go in as backup. But if we have any updates that we want to make, I can obviously give those verbally. So John, does that answer your question? Is that what you are looking for? Is that what I was talking about doing on Monday, or is there something else that that you'd like me to ask specifically for feedback on?
No, Megan, I think that's a good start, and it depends on what we get back, the confirmation and the comments that we get back. I think as far as what we can give, that's what we need to give. But we then need to make sure that we are adjusting according to the feedback that we get back.
Yep. Yeah, we want to be useful. The whole point here is not to tilt
Right.
at windmills.
Yeah,
Right.
and I would just say, or add to that a key actionable item, I would think, that we might want to gauge the joint board, where they stand on, is the whole idea of the listening piece, and giving citizens an opportunity to vocalize, to share with us, like, how they're feeling climate change affects today, like what does it mean in their lives in real terms. And I feel like it's really important that listening piece, whether it's a listening session, not a formal town hall or whatever it is, but that be very deliberate and early on, even if we are still sort of formulating what it is we have to get back, just I think it's just critical that we also recognize that's an important role and task. I don't know if others agree, but we're not going to have answers immediately, but just understanding where the community's at, I think is necessary early on.
I agree.
Yeah. So with that in mind, community engagement, this item has just been kind of getting bounced down the agendas. And so when we put it back on the agenda this month, my goal here is it's kind of we need to figure out what we're doing. Is community engagement really a key part of our mission? I think we've all said that we want it to be. We think that it needs to be a key part of what we do here. So how do we want to go about doing that? What does that look like? I think to John's point, and Jennison, to your point, asking the commissioners specifically how, what does this piece look like for us? How do you envision us interacting with the community? What information do you want us to get from the community? And then from there, we can, figure out basically what those questions are, right? We don't want to waste people's time. So what specific questions are we going to ask? But in terms of how we'd like to go about that, I think that's something that also we need to kind of we need to discuss on our own. We need to figure out what we actually want to do, what sort of questions we think are important to ask. And then we'll get the input from the Joint Policy Board and can see how those really line up. So
Megan,
yeah,
I think one thing, and we've been bouncing around talking about this for quite a while, but one of the things we need to do is to get on some common denominator understanding with the community of what climate change is and what we're actually talking about, because it's going to differ. And I think we've said this before, it's going to differ from one community to another. And so we have to make sure that we do a little bit of, let's get on the same page of what we're talking about. And then we can look at what the impacts might be. But I think we have to do a little bit of common denominator education. And that could be our role. And then we can start to get information that has some commonality to it, because everybody is kind of at least have some common denominator of what we're talking about. And one of those words we've used a lot is resiliency. And so we're basically trying to see how we can make your community resilient. We're trying to see how we can reduce the impact of things. And that's going to, that's going to mean different things to different people.
How do you envision that education piece? What do you envision that looking like? Is that something where you see sort of at the beginning of sort of an in-person listening session or town hall where we would speak about this? Is this something more where you think it's putting together like a 1 or 2 page document, or trying to do something that's more interactive on a website? I mean, what?
We talked about this once, and one of the things that came out of it is we thought it might be more useful if we went to the people. Things like churches, community meetings, at the for example, in Duval area, we could go. They have a neighborhood community center. We had talked about maybe going to those kinds of places and meeting with different maybe organizations and getting on their agenda. And then maybe talking, maybe even specifically to what might be an impact in their neighborhood. For, flooding might be an area of concern in certain parts of the city. How can we take some weak links in your area and make them stronger?
Sounds good. Yeah. Christine, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. John, I agree. That is exactly what we discussed early on, talking about going to people and meeting with them and finding out their thoughts on what their concerns were. And I think what would come out of that is also a better understanding of language that people, language related to climate change that people are good with, and language related to climate change that people may be really resistant to. I think that if we're going out and deciding to do this, we're going to have to really have a good understanding of what gets people on board with understanding, sharing their potential impacts, and then accepting whatever changes come forward out of this, because the goal of this project is to make a plan that is implemented pretty holistically. So I think that getting an understanding from the community about what they see as the impacts, but also how to best approach the discussion of climate change with them, because I see it as we get the information first, we have an understanding, and then once we get through the scenario phase and we're saying these are actually the policies and these are the implications of the things that are coming out of this, I think it needs to go back to the community and say, you know, what is your level of, what are you going to accept here? What is your level of agreement with some of these things? And what is your level of acceptable change with a lot of these things? Because this isn't just you know, this goes beyond, I mean, for God's sakes, plastic straws created a huge, you know, thing around here. I can't imagine what some of the things that might be recommended from this climate action plan might do.
Thanks, Christine. James, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think it's just as everybody else has said, I think it's absolutely essential that we do public outreach. But I also see a connection. You were just asking for clarity with what the commissioners wanted out of this committee. And I see a relationship between public outreach and that gap analysis, or either public outreach as a part of that or as a side component to it. And so I guess what I'm really saying is that it would be good to have a clear purpose. What we're delivering, what product we're going to be putting out there, because I think that that's what we communicate. And I think that once we know who we are, what we're doing, what we're about, then we can communicate that message. And so it might be difficult. We don't know what we're trying to say. It's going to be hard to have a conversation. So.
Yep. Christine.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that completely. And I think in as part of that is also getting a level of agreement from city, county, GRU, et cetera, about where, you know, if the public provides certain input and certain information, how much of that's going to be taken into consideration at what, you know, going back to the discussion we had early on about the levels of public engagement, where is that public input? Where does it fit in? And how much of it's going to be considered and to what level? Because if we do take people's time and collect all this information and it just goes into nowhere, they're going to be pretty ticked. So I think finding out, you know, how much of public input is actually going to be utilized in terms of making this plan is also really important.
Yeah. Jennison, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just thinking about that, using the information that we're getting and seeking out the most useful feedback from the community. I think one of the, you know, if we step back and think about this on a longer time horizon, at the end of the day, it's like, so what is it we're trying, regardless of whether or how we frame the issue of climate, at the end of the day, what is it we're trying to protect? And so I think, like, ultimately asking and trying to understand where the community is coming from in terms of, you know, 10, 20, 30 years from now, like what are the parts of this community and the assets and, you know, of your livelihoods that you value the most, that you're trying to protect. I know it sounds like really high level, But at the end of the day, if we're not working backwards from some sort of tangible, quality of life outcomes that we're trying to achieve for the community, then it's easy to get lost in the details along the way. So I think it's, for me, what I would envision seeking is being able to kind of paint that picture of what it is that this community, the various communities within our community, are trying to protect moving forward. And there are ways we can frame or prompt that discussion. Does that make sense, John? I see you.
Yes, it does. And we use the word hardening a community. Hardening means basically making it resistant to, and so again, it's going to depend on each community, and that's where we get that community engagement. Once we once we frame for them what we're trying to do, and how the concept of climate change fits into their real life, and once we make that connection, we can then figure out on a tangible basis what we need to do in Northwest Gainesville, what we need to do in Gainesville as a whole, to make it hard and make it resistant to the different types of measures that might come about with climate change. And then we make it personal. Then we'll be making it personal to the community.
So what I'm hearing is that we need, so trying to go in with something specific and have specific asks for the community. So the way that I've been looking at this, and I'm obviously totally open to changing this tactic, but the way that I've been sort of envisioning this is that with the scenarios that we're working on, we're basically trying to go in not with a blank piece of paper, because anyone who's ever tried to write, you go in and you look at that blank piece of paper and you don't even know where to start. So what I've been trying to get us to do is do some of that initial brainstorming. So we started thinking about what are specific impacts on our community in Gainesville. What have we seen when, or not just in Gainesville, but in Alachua County, the outlying communities as well. But like, what have we seen when a hurricane comes through? For those folks who were here during our last drought and wildfire, what were the impacts of that? For heat, what are the impacts of that? So we do the background, we do the brainstorming, and then we can take that to the community and say, okay, these are the things that are already on our radar. Which of these things are you concerned about? What is your level of concern, and how have these issues specifically impacted you? And then what have we missed? So we're going in and we're trying to get feedback about specific things that we know are important, or that we not necessarily know are important, things that we know are related and that are potential impacts, get feedback about how important those are to the community, how much they've already impacted the community, and then give the community the opportunity to tell us what we haven't thought of yet. Exactly. And then take that, so those two pieces, sort of the background piece and then the refinement from the community, plus them adding on to whatever we've missed, put that all together, and then that's kind of the piece that goes back up to the commissioners, to the policy board, to say, okay, these are the things that that we are most concerned about in our community based on the science, based on past experience, and based on community feedback.
And it's going to differ in each area of the community, because of each area has different impact, things impact different areas differently. And so the first priority might be flooding in one area. It might be electrical grid conditions in other areas. So, but that's the kind of feedback we should be getting from, the people. Then we kind of make it personal. We make it they become part of the plan.
I would love to do something, and Something I used to do in meetings, public meetings, was we had lists of priorities or list of concerns or list of issues, depending on what the meeting was. And people would look at them, they would discuss them, they would prioritize them. We would collect information on what additional concerns there might be. And that could be, I mean, when I used to do that, it was in several meetings that we would do that, but you could potentially consolidate something like that into one meeting where we take what we've collected and what we see as our top concerns for an area, because I would assume this is location specific, like John's suggesting. And then really get people's input and kind of more of a hands-on thing. I think the online survey that's going to be done is going to be very useful. But I also think that getting community leaders and people who are community leaders is a term, community leaders, not in necessarily the political sense or the, they're holding the highest position sense, but the people who are well respected in a community and are looked up to, and getting them to come in and into a room and sit down and talk and really kind of look at like you said, Megan, the information that we've collected and give us their honest feedback on which things they really think are the most important or the most concerning, what things we've missed. And then I have this vision of, trying to do in terms of what John's talking about, a kind of a map analysis where we'll find out that the different areas of the county have very different concerns, and we can kind of just visualize, if you will, what areas based on geography, population, land use, et cetera, could be potentially impacted. I know that's kind of rambling, but yeah.
No, I think that's great. I love the idea of having a visual representation at the end of this. Yeah, I think that's great.
But along those lines, I do think it's going to be really important for us with what the consultants are doing and with other work that's being done to make sure that our vocabulary is all the same. We're really going to have to use the same terminology, because if there's a survey going out using one sort of terminology, they're holding meetings, I'm assuming, that's going to be using terminology. We need to be all linked in, because it will very quickly become confusing, because nobody's going to understand that we're kind of coming at this from different angles.
Yeah, Heather or Steve, can you speak to that in terms of like the survey that Jones Edmonds is filling out or sending out? Can they send that to us? Can we look at that before it gets sent out so that we can align the vocabulary? And also, if there's you mentioned the equity officer had also volunteered to help look over that. So if we could have her look at it and give us a chance to look at it, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and then to make refinements before it's actually sent out, so that we are using the language that is going to be, or that we hope is going to be most effective.
Yeah, I think that's a clear opportunity we'll have. I'm expecting them to start drafting those questions in January. And so maybe the February meeting might be an ideal time for us to maybe look at those questions along with the county staff. So yeah, well, I know they're very concerned about making sure it's language that is terms that they can understand in terms of meaning to them, for meaning for them to understand, as opposed to choosing jargon that maybe the scientific community uses that's not really translated very well. So I think we could have an opportunity then to provide that input, and that way it helps us moving forward as well. So yeah, I think we can do that.
Sounds great. Yeah, I think it's the scientific jargon is definitely a concern. I think the other concern is this issue that we're just talking about, how some language people are open to, and then some language just kind of raises people's hackles just because of prior experience, or sort of your philosophical or political bent or background. There are words that mean different things to different people, and we want to make sure that the language is both consistent, but also people read it and they have a more open and curious reaction to answering it, rather than, we want to basically avoid sort of knee-jerk emotional reactions that shut people down. We want to keep everybody open and part of the conversation.
We've been talking about the resiliency and things like that. There's also the other part that tends to be a little bit more less palatable, is the prevention part. What can we do, and what are some of the actions that the community can do in terms of reduction of fossil fuel, reduction of waste, all the things that help protect our environment. And this is that education part that we can, also bring into the conversation.
Yeah, I agreed. I think, this focus on resilience and on immediate disaster shocks is really, that's just, we had to pick something to go first.
Right.
And this was in my mind, this is just the thing that we're going to do first. It's absolutely not the only thing. And it doesn't mean that we are abandoning mitigation or prevention at all. I see Jennison and James. Jennison, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, Christine, your point about making sure we don't cross wires with the Jones-Edmonds survey, not just in terms of content and language, but in terms of timing is going to be really critical. And if we are able to, which it sounds like, Steve, sounds like we'll be able to do this, if we're able to coordinate so that that survey can cross-reference or refer to whatever community engagement, listening sessions, or whatever we decide is going to happen, concurrently with that or complementary to that through CCAC or liaisons, I think will be really important, because, if you see an invitation come across your plate to work on this survey or whatever, and you're like, well, does this have anything to do with this other, work going on? It's like we want to not just portray and communicate that we're in line, but we actually need to be in line with each other in terms of the timing as we collect the feedback. And so not to micromanage the way Jones-Edmonds is doing the online survey, but just to make sure that they're complementary. And your point's really good, Megan. I've done a lot of survey work in the past, but yeah, it's like we need to be really careful not to bias the sample itself by just turning people off if they see, that's kind of beating a dead horse that we've gone over and over and over again, how important the framing is, but just that, how we can do that and still be genuine with what we're seeking from them will be important. Yeah.
And challenging.
And challenging. It's always challenging. If it were easy, someone would have already done it, right?
Right.
And found all the answers.
If only we had that person's phone number.
Yes.
James, please go ahead.
I think what seems to be crystallizing in my mind is the question of whether we're going to be doing any community organization around a message or some activity or behavior that we're trying to change. And I don't know if there's scope for that, given that we're affiliated with the city. But it would seem that at this point, we're still doing a fact-finding mission. And I'm wondering how we can translate that into doing something about it. And I think that's related to the communication piece, because typically if you're communicating something, you're trying to persuade somebody to do something. And so I don't know if it would be interesting or worthwhile to start considering some things that we might wish the community changes, or whether we just want to keep it on an individual level. Yeah, it's like just looking for impact. How do we get the greatest impact for what we're doing?
So is your question more asking the community to change, and by community, like individuals or groups within the community to work with their members, or is that change that you're looking for more on the sort of legislative level?
I'm kind of raising that as a question for all of you, of what the level of interest is, if there is interest in doing something like that. I know that we've mentioned meeting with different government authorities or agencies, and also meeting with, community leaders. But then it kind of goes back to that question of, are we just going to continue gathering information, or do we want to try to, like I said, do something about it? And so I don't know. I'm kind of raising that question to everybody to see where we're at with that.
So from the standpoint of what we know now, the Joint Policy Board is composed of members of the City Commission and the members of the County Commission. And so one of the things that we're going to do about it is to, when we come up with suggestions or advice, we're an advisory board, is to take that to the Joint Policy Board to have them sort of bring it to their larger commissions. That doesn't have to stop there. I mean, we can also meet individually with individual commissioners to really make the case. So that's something that we know we're going to do. That's one part that absolutely does not have to be the only thing that we do and the only way that we interact. But that is one way that we have been asked to interact. That's kind of why we were formed, is to be able to advise those bodies.
So it's been, James, it's been told to us a couple of times that we are an advisory board, and we are basically giving advice to the Joint Commission. And as far as the action, it would have to come from them.
That's not to say that we can't go out and try to
Lobby.
work within to lobby, basically, whether it's lobbying individual elected officials or whether it's working to have a conversation with key staff members, or whether it's going out and engaging in a more persuasive way with groups within the community. We're certainly not limited to advising the commissions, but that is our main charge. So, did I cut someone off? No? Okay. So we've been trying to nail some things down. And so at the very beginning of the board, I think last year, we kind of divvied this up into kind of a science group and a communications group. A lot of the communications group are gone now, and we haven't exactly tried to refill the communications group, but I know that Jennison and Christine were both interested in that aspect. I think, John, you were as well. And so how would you all, I feel like we need something concrete, right? We just keep talking about this. We need something concrete so that we can try to hone it rather than just speaking in general terms. So Christine put together a really excellent communications plan, sort of outline, what are the things that we need to be thinking about, and was really getting into these questions of what do we want from the members of the community. If we're going to take their time, what are we going to give them? What are we seeking from them? And so in terms of a communication plan, I would love it if someone wanted to kind of take lead on this, but in terms of coming up with a communications plan, answering the really basic questions of a party invite. So who, what groups do we want to talk to? I think we certainly can go out and invite individual members of the community, but I think that, to John's point, speaking with existing community groups who already are listening to key groups within the community is something where we can really have that can save us a lot of time. If we can identify groups that are representing a lot of the people that we want to hear from, and then speak to those groups and the leaders of those groups who do have a good ear out there in the community and who are respected. So who groups, specific community groups and or sort of if there are demographics that we really want to reach, you know, whether that's geographic, whether that's socioeconomic, you know, who do we really want to be talking to with this, and who do we want to learn from and engage with, and then so the specific questions that we want to ask and the information that we're seeking. I think one of the questions that I would like to ask is basically we take sort of that scenario inventory that we put together and say, hey, what do you all think about this? You know, these are the things that we've come up with. How important are these issues to you? Are these issues that have already impacted you? Are these issues that you are worried about impacting you in the future? And then kind of get a gauge on how much, right? Everybody be like, yeah, you know, that's kind of important. Or like, no, this is impacting me on like a weekly you know, basis right now. And I'm really worried about what's going to happen in the future. And then to ask, hey, what did we miss? You know, are there other things that are really pressing that we haven't asked you about? So who, what, when? So Jones Edmonds is trying to get their survey out in like January, February. So do we want to try to coincide with that? Do we want to try to, getting ahead of it would be kind of difficult at this point. So do we want to do something where it's more of a follow-up to that, where we're really targeting the spring? How many events do we want to have? Do we want to, you know, take a look at the calendars of different community groups and say, hey, can we just get on your agenda, and we target that for, you know, February, March, and April? Do we want to actually plan independent, like sort of town halls or listening sessions? If we want to do that, you know, when do we want to target that, and how many of those events do we want to have? And then the final question, the big one, who's going to be organizing the logistics of this? And right now we're talking in generals, but I can tell other people are kind of chomping at the bit the same way I am, where like we just want to get going, like we want to get something done, and we want to actually start this process. And so in order to do that, we need to have some of these specifics. We need to have a plan. So Jennison, I see you and Christine. Jennison.
Yeah, I keep going around in my mind about, you know, when we talk about posing the question, about framing it and identifying the impacts up front first, and then saying, what have we missed, versus flipping it on its head and saying, what is it you care about? And then where does climate come into that? You know, I think the latter is going to be more comprehensive in terms of getting us to what the real concerns are that people are thinking of, as opposed to narrowing the scope at the start and beginning by talking about these identified vulnerabilities and risks of climate change and what we know is happening, and then trying to make it broader. And so in terms of what that means in a tangible way, what I'm thinking is maybe with the Jones Edmonds, I'm looking at the stakeholder engagement section of their scope right now, but maybe we intentionally ask that survey be pretty wide open in terms of those questions about like, what is it, you know, that you value most in the community, and like how, or what are you most concerned about, flooding, you know, like have it be pretty comprehensive, not targeted just at climate change. And then that can give us the foundation from which we can go deeper in the conversations, the community conversations throughout the community, without essentially leading the respondents by taking all these other concerns and issues off the plate from the very first question. Do you know what I mean?
No, I think that's 100% correct. Otherwise, we're unnecessarily and prematurely narrowing the scope. But also, I mean, to your point about asking what you're concerned about and not narrowing it to climate change, in terms of how we frame things going forward, knowing what people's values are from that more open-ended beginning question is really key information to being able to frame it in a way that's going to engage with what they already care about.
Yeah.
That's great. Steve, is that something that you can, or Heather? Heather, I'm looking to see you now because I'm like, I normally want to ask you, but I realize that you'd be like, ciao, here in a few weeks. But Steve, is that something that that you could engage with Jones Edmondson? Like, how much say do you have in that process? Because I mean, Jennison's point, I think, is really key if we are looking to understand people's concerns. And I mean, John made the point earlier, like, what are we actually talking about? Like, what does climate change mean? If we use the term climate change up front, we don't know what people are chopping out and saying this isn't climate change, because we don't know how they define it. So by keeping it nice and broad at the beginning, I think we're going to capture more information, but I don't know how much say we get to have in that.
Yeah, they're just getting started. In fact, we basically the bids getting signed, this past week. So I think we'll be getting with them in early January, and the team that, Shane and Stacy and I and a few others involved, we can bring up that question and really start to talk to them, because when you read, and I know, Jennison, you just are looking at it, there's a lot there that says we're going to get with the county to make sure we're asking the right questions. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to make sure that we're guiding them in a way that we're getting enough information we feel comfortable with, and it's getting presented in a way that we would like to see it presented. So yes, I do think there's an opportunity there. So hopefully at our next meeting in January, we'll be able to kind of get into this a little bit and hopefully have some updates as to where the discussion is on developing the questions, because I think there'd be an opportunity there to really collaborate.
Awesome.
Oh, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, we got back to not putting a blank sheet of paper on the table. I think that broad areas, for example, communities need food access. Communities need transportation. Communities need ability to get to gas stations. So are these things going to be open? How far does the community, and these are things, as you mentioned, Genesis, that are everyday things anyway, and they just get compounded during a disaster. So when we go into, and we don't go in asking specific questions, but we ask broad subjects. How do you feel your community is geared up for food access? How do you feel that your community is geared up for the resources that you need in your everyday life? Where the service stations located? How far do you have to travel to get to a drugstore? These are the kinds of things that I think, my background is utility, and I added up one day that I probably have done like 9 hurricanes in my career. So all these things, I kind of know that these are the things that become very prevalent in people's mind during a disaster. But these are the same things that are out there anyway. It just gets amplified in a disaster. And one of the things that we made sure of was that the hospitals were in power. We made sure that the gas stations were there. We made sure that Publix had generators. All of these things we did because we wanted to make sure to reduce some of the impact of these disasters. So I think by asking broadness about the current state of your community, it is a good way to start.
Yeah, that's great. By having the sort of broad categories of work, you're not constraining it, but you're helping to focus.
Exactly. Right. And I like you, John, you said it, what I was thinking much more eloquently than I would have said it, but it's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We want to get a sense of how secure people feel or how well our community's meeting those needs. And then we can infer, like, then digging deeper, we know how to work backward from that. We know how all of those various needs and food systems and health and all these, are going to be impacted and being impacted by climate change. So we don't even have to say it. Yeah.
Christine, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jennison. I really like the way you phrased that, John, and the way you presented it, because I think that hits right into the ability to avoid having climate change be the front and center and potentially very polarizing topic of conversation. Instead, we're asking communities about how they feel about the things that we know are going to be impacted. So this disaster shock impacts analysis plays right into that. We will be able to, by doing that, we can see down the line what's going to happen, and we can talk with communities about how they feel about where they are with all these different elements. And your point was so good. I completely forgot why I raised my hand before, but I think what it was really, oh, I remember now. Steve, would there be a chance for us to meet with Jones Edmonds and find out more about what they're doing? I apologize, I have not read the scope, but that to me would be not so much to be necessarily completely influencing them, but I think if we can understand what they're going to be working on and focusing on, and can kind of talk about what we're doing, that would really help us. And then that would also position us to piggyback on the information they're collecting and to really be more effective.
Yeah, their intention is to provide information to you all, either when they complete steps along the way. So they're going to be giving you an explanation of what they're doing and what they're finding. But I do think there's a part early on about the community outreach that I think they'd be willing to collaborate with us on. So I'll find out, whether it would be a January, maybe February meeting, that maybe we can get a representative there who's focused on the community outreach part of this, that maybe that'll be one of our action items, is to get a Jones Edmonds team member. It might not actually be Jones Edmonds themselves, but it'll be the person who's working on the community engagement part, to see if they can join us in one of the meetings. Maybe it'll have to be a sub meeting on community outreach based on the timing, because we meet only once a month, but we'll work on that. That'll be one of the action items.
Yeah, that would be extremely helpful and informative for us. And Megan, to what you were talking about getting things down and really kind of starting to flesh this out, I think with the information that what we just discussed here, and with the information we'll be getting from Jones Edmonds, I think I'd feel comfortable just after this meeting, in between meetings, putting something down, just kind of a framework of ideas of what we could be doing and sharing it. And then everybody can agree or disagree or add to it, et cetera. I don't think we need to keep going down this road. I think we've got some good ideas right now. My biggest question is going to be, what is the final result of the community engagement? What do we really want to get out of it? But I think this discussion has really helped start framing that. So if you all are okay with that, I can just put something down and share it with everybody, and we can add in. So the communications group, kind of like the disaster analysis framework, we can be working on communications at the same time.
That would be awesome.
Maybe what we can get out of it would be maybe prioritize things in terms of the community, and then what do they see as their majors, and maybe that would be at least a step.
That's great. Thank you, John.
Yeah, sorry, if you see my head down, it's because I'm actually taking notes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's great. And I think it's the Jones Edmonds survey will help us understand sort of the domain of concerns and the way people talk about how they're being affected, how their needs are being affected and what they value. And then the follow on that's coordinated with that will give us the ability then to solicit feedback so that we understand how the larger community prioritizes those things. So
I also think we need to be sensitive to the fact that we want to reach more people than will be reached by an online survey, right? So like the most vulnerable people in our community are not generally the ones who are gonna have the time to be answering an online survey about climate change, right? They're gonna be too worried about working their third job and taking care of their kids and all these other things. So in terms of like being able to piggyback and not duplicate, I think one really key thing for us will be reaching those people who are probably not going to be heard via the online survey.
yes, and
Right.
actually that reminds me of one other, when I was reading through the scope, that was one thought I had, or sort of a recommendation that this not be that it not be only online, if possible, that people have the ability to get a hard copy mailed to them if they want to, or you know what I mean, that they can complete a hard copy, and also that there's some sort of a randomized incentive for participation, so that, I mean, like a token, I mean, you're more likely to get the participation if there's some other incentive there, and we know we can't give everybody, anyway, just I
You'll be
think
entered to win a $25 gift card.
well, and actually I just did a survey where it was like, I was
Really?
told we were allowed to do it, like every 25th person who responded got a $50 gift card. You know what I mean? You have to do it so that everyone has the same likelihood of getting the reward or whatever. But yeah, but the first point is like the access idea, that not everybody's going to have a smartphone and be able to scan a QR code or go online and do it. And if we're really trying to be, get a good representation of the community, that it sounds really old fashioned, but the hard copy can go a long way. Like we've delivered, I delivered surveys to people's doorsteps before, and, hang it in a bag and say, hang it back. Anyway, I just think like, now's the time to do it. If Jones Edmonds is doing this in their scope, like let's try to help and make sure they do it. Get the best representation, knowing it's really hard to survey people.
Agreed. All right, do we have anything else on community engagement before we leave the topic? No? Christine, thank you very, very much for volunteering to take first crack at this. I think we just need a place to start, so we're not going to just like leave you out to do all this on your own. I think we just really need a place to start, and that will be super valuable and helpful. It is 7:10, so before we move on to the next item, do we all want to take a quick little 5-minute break? All right, cool.
Sounds good.
All right, then we'll see you back here at 7:15. All right, welcome back. See some beverages, some snacks, sustenance. All right. So next up is the discussion of hyperlocal climate disaster impacts or the shocks to the system. So that's the spreadsheet that Christine was kind enough to put together and send out to us, where we were looking at the 3 sort of weather or climate related disasters that are most relevant to our region. So we decided that was going to be hurricanes, droughts and wildfires, and excessive heat. So in terms of actually looking at the science of climate change, what are the impacts that are going to be most relevant, weather specifically impacts that are going to be most relevant for our community, and then what does that look like on a hyperlocal level, including considering sort of those compounding events. So if then what, and what other systems might become involved. So how did everybody feel about that? Were we able to complete it? Was it confusing? Was it, kind of, did it make sense in terms of being able to capture what you think are the impacts or the concerns related to these events? Because again, kind of the end goal with this is to put together a list of impacts that is kind of our brainstorming session. So when we go and we talk to the community, we know that these are our issues. And so we both want to hear from them what they are most concerned about, and then also get from them feedback on these issues. How important are they? Have they experienced these sorts of impacts? Are they worried about these sorts of impacts?
I think I think it was a good platform to put down some specific things, that I thought the examples that was given kind of put us in the right area. I took one and just sort of worked through it just to see if I could stay on the same parallel that that the example led. And I think it's a good way to think through a specific problem.
Thank you, John. Anybody else?
Sorry, I missed last meeting, so I didn't feel too knowledgeable or prepared to look through it.
Okay. Hopefully this will, if you have any questions, I mean, we can talk through it, but
Yeah,
the
I was
idea
looking
really
at
is just,
this. I was looking at the spreadsheet, but I only see one scenario. It's just
yeah,
diversion.
we come up with the rest of them.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, I mean, like, Heather sent me Amanda's because Amanda wasn't going to be able to make it, but she sent hers on. So I took a look at Amanda's, the one that I put together. I mean, so unfortunately they kind of aligned, but she thought of things that I didn't think of. So I was working kind of as intended, and then we're each going to come at it from our own perspectives, and we're all going to ideally think of some things that other members of the group had not thought about, while also adding our, our perspective and our expertise. So like for hurricanes, I kind of split hurricane impacts into heavy rainfall, flooding, high winds, general impacts, and then mental health impacts. And from there, for heavy rainfall and flooding, had roadways blocked, drinking water contamination, overwhelmed sewer systems, both stormwater and sanitary, flood damage to buildings, and then aerial flooding. And from each of those kind of, considered, okay, what does that mean? So roadways blocked was the example given, right? So we had that, but so drinking water contamination, the secondary or cascading impact was contamination of drinking water, private wells and surface water by septic system, sewage possibly overflow from sanitary sewer systems, and then the compounding event would be the health impacts of that, the disease spread that could come from that sort of event. Or one of them was flood damage to buildings. So secondary impact from that would be people displaced or living in unsafe conditions, and sort of cascading from that would be health impacts, respiratory ailments due to mold and mildew growth and flood damaged buildings, Health impacts, people living in close quarters, like shelters, can lead to outbreaks of communicable diseases. And then financial impacts, people without adequate insurance may not be able to afford repairs. So just kind of thinking through, if this, then what? Like, what are kind of the follow-on impacts, so that ideally we, we'll take each of our contributions and consolidate or synthesize those down into sort of a list that we take into the community and say, again, I really like Jennison and John's approach to stay kind of broad categories in the beginning, but then be able to ask, how are you guys concerned about these sorts of things? But so we have a list, so we have somewhere to start. Yeah, so that's the ultimate goal here, to get the lay of the land. So
I found that I had a lot of the same items that you mentioned, Megan, and especially as we get down to the impacts, the compound, the compoundness of everything. It usually boils down to, in a structure, it gets down to food, it gets down to transportation, it gets down to people mental condition. That when we get down to that level, it's usually it's going to affect people. It's going to affect the structures and things like that. No matter what major scenario we're kind of talking about. And I think the specific impact kind of differs. With heat, you will be talking more about the health aspect of it, and then maybe some of the solutions might be having a air-conditioned place or having a safe place for people to go, that kind of thing. But it always kind of boils down to that compound effect of structure and people's health and safety. And then that kind of boils down to economics.
Yep.
It's always going to end up sometimes boiling down to economics from the standpoint of how you can prepare to resist the impact of.
Yeah, preparedness and recovery.
And recovery, yes.
Thank you, Jennison.
Yeah, related to recovery, and I admit I didn't do the exercise or get it done myself. I've been thinking through it, but one of the components for any of these scenarios, I think, is that we can note or make that we should think about is the persistence of that and how long the recovery period is. Like, if the cascading effect is that somebody essentially loses their shelter, that's a much longer term impact than if, a roadway is blocked by a down tree and they, what I mean? Like, I think understanding how the time frame for that recovery period, I guess, will be important, and it'll be different for different communities too.
Yeah. I actually had one where I called it under preparation or under resourced, because some people don't prepare, but they could, and some people literally do not have the resources to be able to prepare.
Right.
But I've written that out saying, many individuals and businesses will fail for whatever reason to adequately prepare for tropical cyclones. So the short-term needs would be food, water, shelter, and transportation. But the financial need, the long-term needs, you need financial aid for recovery. Like, people lose their home, they become homeless. Business is forced to close. Those employees lose their job. This community loses the revenue and the benefits of that business. It's definitely not. I think that's where, in general, that's where we fail, is the long term. We sort of think the immediate threat is past, and then we wash our hands.
Exactly.
And move on.
But I also I also think that John's point about it coming down to economics, the cost of that recovery, at the end of the day, the decisions we make, what we're trying to do is make the cost-effective decision that's minimizing what those long-term costs are. And like you're saying, maybe if it's the preparation and there are barriers to that preparation that could cost a lot less to remove those barriers than to deal with these long-term recovery costs. You know, it's like, it's important to have that understanding in terms of the cost of prevention versus, you know, costs of dealing with it after the fact, and then everybody going back to their regular lives, and then it's just going to happen again, and there's no long-term preparedness. So having the economics in that equation will be helpful.
Yeah.
And I think also when we think about our systems, for example, our GRU system, our grid system, when we think about our flood system, we can apply the same concept. We learn so much from hurricanes, and so we adjust accordingly. We build so that we can keep reducing the impact of. You know, we put in concrete poles when we can. We go underground when we can. We always reduce using economics again, putting money up front to reduce the impact of things in the end. The same as, you know, as we do as individuals.
I don't know if you've looked at more, it sounds like a lot of the physical infrastructure is being discussed, but simple social disintegration in terms of isolation and even political capital. If people become stranded from one another and they can't raise a voice, they can't receive assistance because the people that may have resources aren't even able to hear them. And so I know that, like, having worked in New Orleans after Katrina, so many families moved out after the storm that all of the communication and social networks were completely broken down. And so then the assistance that might have been available was not able to find its way there. So that's kind of a soft or a more abstract resource. I don't know if you guys have that on your list.
Not yet, does now. I mean, and this is why, you know, I wanted to send it out and to get all of our input on this, because I hadn't thought of that. You're absolutely correct, James, but that was not on my radar. And so by sort of pooling our knowledge, we can get a much more comprehensive picture of what the impacts are.
And it's, you know, another kind of side effect of that is every single person just in this call has a different skill set. And so, you know, I may not be able to solve a problem, but John can, or Christine can. But if that communication network breaks down, then problem solving breaks down, because there's, you know, those skill sets are no longer available. Yeah, so it's also tied. We've talked a lot about communication tonight. It seems to be another example of the importance of that.
Very good stuff. Thank you. I'm taking notes. So if any, so I didn't ask last time for us to send this to Heather, I guess at this point to Steve. But for next time, I guess if there's any, let's work out the kinks here. So like any questions we have or any clarity that we need about, you know, what does this mean, or what are we specifically looking for? Like we have that conversation now, and then for next meeting, we send this out to Steve so that we have this, you know, everybody's input. And then does anyone want to volunteer to sort of consolidate that? James? Awesome, thank you. And then I'm going to, for the next meeting, I'm going to consolidate the city, county, and GRU, their responses to the survey about current policies and future upcoming initiatives. So I will also send that out. I'm gonna probably keep it in a spreadsheet form, just at least initially until we figure out what we want it to look like, and I will send that to Steve as well. And that way, for our January meeting, we'll have, actually, we'll probably have more than we can handle in a couple of hours, but that'll be great. To have the consolidated list from the disaster scenario assessment, the communications plan from Christine, and then a consolidated list of policy or climate change related initiatives from the city, county, and GRU, and that'll give us a really good jumping off point, I think. So is anyone keeping track of homework? Can you put us, awesome, thank you, Christine. All right, do we have anything else to add on this topic before we move on?
Just the question. So the 3 scenarios are hurricane, heat, and what was the last one?
Drought and wildfire.
Okay.
So we haven't had, there hasn't really been a bad drought or wildfire since I've been here. But was it 05? Someone who's been here longer than me. Was 05 the bad year, really bad year?
1998 was real bad for wildfire too.
98, okay. I saw Jenison 7, was it 07? 07 was really bad. So yeah, so like drought and wildfire doesn't seem super pressing right now, but then all it takes is we don't get some good hurricane rain in the summer, and then fall is dry and spring is dry, and it'll light.
Yeah, we actually almost lost the town of Waldo. So there was several small towns that were threatened, and Waldo was really threatened.
Was that in 07 or 98?
98?
Yeah.
Is that 96, 98? I can't remember.
Florida actually does, like the Southeast US is actually really, really quite good with setting intentional burns and fire management. Actually a lot better than the West. So we're ahead of the game there. They're definitely still concerned.
Yeah, Florida is one of the most progressive states in the entire country in terms of wildfire, and actually a lot of the they do a lot of wildfire training here of people all over the country. But a lot of those lessons learned came from those wildfires in the 90s when so much happened. But yeah, they're very progressive about prescribed burning, but they need to be.
Yeah, I mean, in some of this, like knowing that with wildfires that we are really ahead of the game. Some of what we're finding, like the gap analysis, maybe there's not that many gaps there, but maybe there's a really good story to tell, to say, hey, this is where we are ahead of the game. Like we're taking really progressive action to help protect our communities from this impact, from this threat.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say it's very true, but all it takes is one big hurricane to come through and put a lot of timber on the ground, and then you end up with, in a few years, you end up with a wildfire threat. But yes, it is something that could be pointed to for sure.
For sure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kindling.
And one thing I remember from 07 is because, well, I know ER visits for acute respiratory, that they jump, but I had like a reaction to we had like 3 or 4 days where there was actually ash on our cars, you go out to the car, and I mean, the air quality was so bad, and I had this I had some sort of allergic reaction that was really terrible that sent me to the ER, and I was on prednisone for like 2 weeks, and all the doctors said is it's probably like poison oak in the oils of poison oak burning, and my immune system just, anyway. So I mean, those cascading effects are very real. Yeah,
that's actually terrifying. That's not just like I felt a little wheezy.
No, it was bad. Yeah, it was
wow.
Really bad.
So upshot of 2020 is they probably have some really good masks lying around for the next wildfire.
Yes. And I was going to say, I'll try to find it. I feel like maybe I mentioned this, but there was a story on NPR, or it was specifically about how Florida's progressive approaches to wildland fire and prescribed fire, and they interviewed like extension agents in Florida or Georgia, I think, and like how they're consulting, with Western states giving advice. So that's something we are actually nationally, like people are coming to Florida to learn how to address wildfires. So that's pretty exciting.
It's always nice when Florida's in the news for competency and not some guy who tried to like take a cold alligator in his backseat and then it thawed,
Not Florida man.
Not Florida
Yeah.
man. All right. So are we, anything else on this item before we move on? Nope.
Megan, I actually missed a homework assignment. There was, I've got that James is going to consolidate the disaster shock impacts. And then it was right when you were asking me who took this down. Yeah. There was one other thing.
I volunteered to consolidate the climate change related initiatives responses from city, county, and GRU to try to get, right now it's in 3 separate documents. So looking through that and trying to get it into a 1-page form. I think ultimately we'll probably want something that's like I don't know, even like an HTML or like a searchable database. I think we're going to want something different ultimately, but just something that puts it all in one place. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for keeping us honest. So our next item is the joint policy board meeting on December 13th. We already kind of touched on this, but I was going to walk y'all through the updates that I was going to give them. So the first update was going to be that we have new members on board who we are really excited to have joined the committee and share their expertise with us. To announce that we have a new, we have a new GRU liaison. So that is Justin. I just realized I need to add a new bullet. We're going to have a new city liaison and a new county liaison. So that is not, those items obviously have not made the slides because those were last month, but that's just something so that we kind of keep them informed that we've got new liaisons coming on board, and that let the joint policy board know that we have moved to quarterly in-person meetings, so that like our January meeting is going to be in person, and then the 2 meetings in between are going to be Zoom workshops. To let them know that we do have the responses for the survey of the city, county, and GRU climate change related initiatives, and just explain the purpose of that, which is to provide an overview of how we're already addressing climate change impacts and use that to identify gaps where additional work is needed. And then that we are considering adopting a framework of immediate shocks versus long-term stressors when evaluating climate change impacts, with a plan to address these immediate shocks first. And then the goals for that would be to understand the current response systems and resources. So that's where that sort of where that policy comes from. But also we had mentioned inviting speakers to come and talk to us about some of these impacts. So we invite someone from, say, emergency management to say, as we start talking about some of these hurricane related impacts, to figure out how that's working. So anyway, understand the current response systems, identify gaps or vulnerabilities in those systems and resources, and then to provide targeted hyperlocal advice to fill the gaps, as just sort of our general framework for how we're approaching climate change, approaching climate change in our community, and then to get their feedback on that. Basically, are they, is that a direction that they want us to take? This end goal of evaluating what things currently look like, identifying gaps and vulnerabilities, and then providing hyper local advice to fill the gaps. Is that an approach that they would like us to fill? Is that a niche that will be helpful and useful? So that was going to be the presentation. So just kind of updating them on what we're doing now, and then asking for their feedback, kind of approval, I guess, of that approach. So the slides are already fixed because that was a week ago, but like I said, I had the opportunity to give verbal updates. So if there's anything else that you all would like me to take to the joint policy board, please let me know.
Megan, do you want to mention the change in day to accommodate the UAB?
Oh, yeah, that's great. Let me know that.
That was part of what's come out of coordinating with them, is to make sure we're not meeting on the same day.
Yep. Yes. Thank you, Heather. Yes, that's great. Anything else? No. All right. So items for the next meeting. I think assuming that we all, all of us who volunteered are able to put together the documents that we promised, I think having an agenda item where we basically present those, if everyone, James and Christine, if you're also comfortable with that, just a brief, here's what I put together. If we, anything where we think we need that to be refined, or need additional information, talk to the rest of the committee about that. At that point, anything, I think probably we need to the community engagement piece, I think will need a longer discussion. So that will probably be a separate item. It seems like that's the most pressing. Well, I mean, tell me if you all agree. I mean, it seems like that's the most pressing thing with Jones Edmonds and the survey probably coming out around the February timeline, that we probably need to get our community engagement plan in place.
Yeah, I would like to, if I can get it together in time, I'd like to have something out to the communications group ahead of the next meeting so they can review it and be ready to discuss. And there's not a way we can circulate it back, is there? Or is there? If I submit something, can it be sent out to the community team? They submit it back, just so we don't have to be looking at something raw starting next meeting. I'd like to get a couple steps ahead. Is that possible?
The challenge you have is they can't respond to what you write without being in a public meeting. So you can all put input in, but you're not going to see what it is until the next meeting.
Steve,
So-
if she sends it out to
That
you,
makes
like the
sense.
raw draft, and you send it out to the communications team, the communications team should theoretically be able to comment on it and send that back to you. Could you
Yes.
then synthesize and anonymize that input and then give it back to Christine? So that it's not, no one is communicating directly with Christine. You're just providing a synthesized document back.
Yeah, I think we could do that.
Okay. Does that help, Christine?
Yeah, and depending on how quickly I can get something together, it would just be nice if we could have the conversation with the communications group, have one iteration of at least looking at it and considering it.
Totally makes sense.
Okay. I'll try to get something out to everybody
Thank
or
you,
over to,
Steve.
Yeah, so if you send it to me, or
Right.
I send it to everyone, they give me feedback, and I'll consolidate it into one document, and then I can send it out before the next meeting.
great.
All right, I'm muted.
The follow-up question to combining or collating all the information, how, Stephen, are you going to be able to send that to me? Or we're kind of running into the same problem?
Can you repeat your question? Because
Yeah,
I
so my,
cleared at the beginning.
yeah, so my task for this next meeting was to be taking everybody's scenario worksheets and then combining them into one. Will you be emailing me what people send you, or is there?
Okay, so what I can do is I can get everyone's that they send to me, and then I can send that to you to consolidate.
Okay.
What we can't do is you can't send that back out and back and forth, so it's got to be just a one-way process.
Right. And then I will do the same thing with the city county GRU survey results. I'll consolidate them, and then Steve, I'll send them to you, and you can send them out to everybody ahead of the meeting. And
Yes.
that way, everybody will have a chance to look at it, and then we have the chance to discuss it at the next meeting and make any refinements that need to happen out,
Yep.
out in the public. Okay. All right, so I think, and is there any other item that we'd like to add for that January meeting? I feel like that that gives us a fairly full plate, but if there's something else that's pressing, we should speak now. No? This may be the first meeting where we're like finishing up early. All right. So meeting recap and action items. Christine, can you help us out?
Okie dokie, let's see what I've got here. So the to-dos are going down. I've got that, sorry. Lily's gonna let us know who this new city liaison is if she finds out and when she finds out more. Getting down, I have that Steve's going to get a representative of Jones Edmonds or their communications team to talk with us during survey development with the community engagement group for the CCAC. Christine will make an initial draft of the community outreach plan, and I'll share it with the group before our next meeting so we can hopefully work on it. James will consolidate the disasters and shock impacts. Megan will consolidate the city county GRU survey results into a 1 to 2 page format. Was there anything that I missed? I ended up taking a lot of notes on this one, so I'm scanning through. All right, then that's it.
Sounds good to me.
And our next meeting will be January 13th in person, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So we will not have a Zoom option for that meeting.
Will we have technology support? Because we're gonna have a bunch of spreadsheets and documents and so on. Is there gonna be a way to have like a laptop and flash drives that we can like use a projector?
Yeah, that room has a projector, and we should be able to connect into it and project what we're looking at on a screen for all of us to see.
Can you all provide the computer and then I guess the documents? So this is more relevant for James and Christine and myself, whatever final format we want to talk about, as we'll need to email that to Steve ahead of time so that Steve can have it preloaded. Does that work?
Yeah, we'll have a computer there, and if you don't get it to me, then bring a flash drive.
Okay, that works. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. So public comment. David, are you still there? I saw you on the chat. You got anything for us? Nope. All right.
No, I don't. Thanks. But it took me a
Okay,
while
yeah.
to unmute myself. Thanks.
Thanks for sticking around. I saw your comment about the El Nino with Atlantic hurricane activity. So
Couldn't help it. I know
No,
you know
no.
that, but I
but that's
couldn't help
totally
it.
relevant, actually. I mean, that's why like wildfires, we say, oh, it's like 98, right? And then 07. Okay, that's 9 years.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
The ENSO cycle, that makes sense, right? And that's also one of those other things where it's like, climate change is not inventing new cycles, it's amplifying existing tendencies and cycles. back to the committee. Does anybody have any final thoughts or parting words of wisdom before we adjourn early for the first time ever? No?
I just want to wish all of our retiring members and liaisons Godspeed.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Agreed, yes, agreed.
Yes. Heather, Lily, you've been wonderful. And I wish you all the best in new adventures.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Same here.
Thank you
And,
for all the work you're doing. I'm looking forward to following it from afar.
Sounds good. Following it with some live music, maybe.
Yeah, thank you guys so much, and I'll probably be seeing you around. So
Sounds good. Yeah, Gainesville is a small town. We'll see you.
yeah.
Heather, you got to send us your favorite hot chicken recipe.
Yeah. And Heather,
Yeah,
thank you for everything on all the committees I've been working on with you. You've been great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.
And Justin, welcome. We look forward to GRU's input.
Thank you, John.
And to everybody else, I hope you all have wonderful and safe holidays. And we'll see you in person on January 13th.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
good night.
Bye.
Right.
All right, don't end the meeting yet.
Recording.